Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the 3 years since we last held an oversight hearing on safety in this committee, there have been 90 accidents involving commercial carriers. Thankfully, none of those were fatal, but still there are a number of concerns. In December, in my state, a Sky West plane on approach to Medford went way below minimums and almost crashed into terrain before they did an evasive climb. 5 days later, up in Washington State, a Horizon airplane landed on the taxiway in Pullman. And in July, an Air Canada A320 nearly landed on top of 5 jetliners with more than 1,000 people on board waiting takeoff in San Francisco. In view of this, Representatives Larson, DeSaunier, and I have requested the GAO review safety in the runway environment. These sort of incidents are not acceptable, and luckily thus far they haven't caused fatalities, but they could in the future. I've raised also questions about the evacuation standards. We're now, as they jam more and more and more and more seats into airplanes, we are not actually physically testing the evacuation standard anymore. They use computer modeling, and I've asked for an investigation of whether that is adequate. I mean, we had one example, and this was a plane that doesn't have the more and more and more jammed in seats. It was a 767 at O'Hare when it took the passengers 2 minutes and 21 seconds to exit a burning aircraft as opposed to 90. Imagine if that had been one of these low-budget airlines where you can barely get your knees in between the seats given the reduction in pitch. We need, we're not going to dictate comfort, but we can certainly be concerned about safety. It took me 7 years to get a rule to get the overwing exit spacing after that horrible fire where people were burned up trying to get out of a plane in Manchester, England. It took them 6 months. We can't be complacent about these kind of things. For more than just about a quarter of a century, since I had a certified mechanic working on my staff, I've been pursuing the whole issue of unapproved parts with the FAA. We're going to have the IG report soon, and we have not yet tightened up the way we need to tighten up in terms of certifying SUPs. I had a bizarre and absurd argument when I was pushing this issue before that if you take a life-limited part that could be burnished up to look kind of like new, but was only good for scrap, that you couldn't require that it be shredded or otherwise indelibly damaged because it's a property right. And I said, well, if the only value is scrap and they're not going to try and sneak it back into the chain by burnishing it up, what's the property right that we're protecting here? And apparently some airlines are catastrophically destroying the parts. My staff witnessed United doing that in San Francisco, but others aren't. And you got to wonder what happens to those parts, which could very easily take down a plane, and we've got to get that resolved. After the ValueJet crash, my amendment, which I'd offered a number of times over the years to strip the FAA of its promotional duties and say they should focus on safety issues, was rejected in the FAA bill that year and was not in the Senate bill, but after the ValueJet crash, they called me up and said, where would we put this in the bill? I said, well, it's not conferenceable. It wasn't in either bill. You rejected it. Well, most of it ended up in the bill in the end, but we still have progress to make there in terms of FAA oversight. As was noted by Ranking Member Larson, we have the strongest pilot training rules in history. Unfortunately, it took a horrific accident to get to that point, and now there's tremendous pushback on that. But when you look at the first officer in that case living in her parents' basement, commuting across the country, because she was earning $15,800 a year, but had probably spent a couple of $100,000 to get her license. They say, oh, we've got a horrible shortage here. Well, market forces are starting to work. Some of these airlines are having to raise their salaries. Yeah, you're going to have a shortage if you try and pay them less than a Greyhound bus driver when they paid $250,000 to get the certificate to fly the plane. I have yet to meet a person in the air who says, geez, if I could have got $10 off, I'd be happy to have someone who has 250 hours in the front seat. I don't think so. So there's some pushback here that's got to be dealt with. And then drones. Congress rather stupidly adopted, an amendment in the FAA bill restricting the FAA regulation of drones flown by recreational users because the model airplane people objected. Well, now there are hundreds of thousands of these things out there with people who have been interfering with firefighting. They've flown one into a helicopter. We've had many near misses with jetliners. Finally, FAA 2.5 years ago, I said, could you figure out what happens when a drone hits a plane? And their first studies are it can cause catastrophic damage because these are brittle and hard. And they haven't even done the engine test yet. Suck one in and see whether we have an uncontained, explosion of the engine. So we've got to change that, and we've got to get a handle on these recreational drones before they take down a commercial airliner and kill people. A lot of work to do. Thank you for holding the hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Peter. I want to thank our witnesses